Happy Sunday morning, everyone. If you celebrate Christmas, there are now only 3 more days to go. And those of us who do mark the holiday find ourselves wondering what's actually real this weekend and what's actually coal. We've heard the term voter fraud a lot in 2013. It's the supposedly huge problem that's been used to justify all of those voter ID laws and other voter restrictions that have been passed in state after state. But there are new definitive numbers that show just how much of a problem this really isn't a problem, actually, after all. Also, President Obama sent a big message this week to his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, by announcing who he'll be sending to the Winter Olympics, or rather, who he won't be sending. All, it seems, because of Russia's policies on gay rights, and the strategy already seems to be paying off. The latest details on how. And I have a bit of a confession to make as well, something I've been wanting to get off my chest for a number of weeks now. It says a lot about me and what I believe most passionately in when it comes to politics, so I'm hoping you'll stick around for that. And we'll also be taking a look at how much of the new movie American Hustle actually happened. It's based on an amazing real-life political corruption scandal of the 1970s. But like Argo before it, how much of it has been changed for dramatic effect? We'll be taking a closer look at what it takes to make a really good political movie when you only have 2 hours to make one. But first, because we only have 2 hours, a big investigation wrapped up this week when on Wednesday, Ohio's Republican Secretary of State, John Husted, announced that his office had uncovered 17 cases of non-citizens voting during the 2012 election in that pivotal swing state. That is 17 cases out of more than 5.6 million people who voted in Ohio last year. This in a presidential election that was decided by over 100,000 votes in that state. 17 entire people who voted when they shouldn't have. Similar search by another Republican Secretary of State, Iowa's Matt Schultz, cost close to $150,000, took about 18 months, and it discovered just about as many cases in that state, 16 instances of supposed voter fraud in that state. Yes, these are comically small numbers in the grand scheme of things, but don't discount the power of such seemingly trivial news, because in the conservative media world, this is a huge, huge scandal and a story that viewers have been hearing about all year long.
Now there are some new voter fraud cases.
New concerns over voter fraud.
A string of voter fraud allegations.
Widespread instances of voter fraud.
Clearly intentional voter fraud.
Fraud, voter fraud, the disenfranchisement of every legitimate voter.
Voter fraud is a very real concern for a certain segment of American society and also for the lawmakers who represent that segment of American society. This year, 8 states passed new laws making it harder to vote, including stricter photo ID requirements, cuts to early voting, and limiting registration efforts. A total of 34 states nationwide have passed voter ID laws since huge Republican gains at the state level in the 2010 midterms. Not all of the laws are in full force at this moment because they haven't been fully implemented yet or because they are being challenged in court. But the intent is there, and the laws are on the books to make it harder for more than 2/3 of the country to vote. And that's not even the full extent of it. In June, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County versus Holder to gut a key section of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the section that required areas with a history of voter discrimination to get prior approval from the Justice Department before changing their voter laws. As soon as that barrier was removed by the court, Texas enacted its new voter ID law, which a federal court had previously called, quote, the most stringent in the country. Another state that had been subject to that prior approval requirement, Florida, began to purge its voter rolls too, flagging some as potential non-citizens. The Miami Herald found that the voters being removed were predominantly Hispanic and actually mostly American citizens. We don't know if it's the legislation and the courts and the media coverage about voting ID stories that are driving public opinion, if that's what makes people believe there's a problem which needs to be fixed. But in a Washington Post poll last year, 74% of Americans said that photo ID, like a driver's license, should be necessary to vote. 48% said that people casting fraudulent ballots in elections is a, quote, major problem, while 33% said it's a minor problem and only 14% said it is not a problem. Question is whether these extensive new laws and restrictions are actually legal. Is that part of the story which has drawn the attention of President Obama's Justice Department?
Some of them, by the way, may be illegal. may violate the Voting Rights Act even after the Supreme Court's recent ruling. And our Justice Department is going to be staying on them. If we have evidence that you have mechanisms that are specifically designed to discriminate against certain groups of voters, then the Justice Department will come down on them and file suit.
And a new academic study released this week shows that the Justice Department has a case, and that, in fact, the Voting Rights Act still matters. Two University of Massachusetts at Boston professors performed a study of voting laws in the 5 years preceding the 2012 election, and they found that new restrictions went hand in hand with race and class. Quoting from their report, the more that minorities and lower-income individuals in the state voted, the more likely such restrictions were to be proposed. When minorities turned out at the polls at higher rates, the legislation was more likely enacted. The study took into account a number of factors and found that voter restrictions passed when more Republicans were elected to state legislatures, or when a Republican was elected governor of a state, even among states that were becoming more competitive in the presidential election. If there were larger Democratic majorities in those states, it was the less likely that they would pass a restrictive voting law. And in a competitive state with bigger Republican majorities, it was more likely they would pass a restrictive law. So clearly, it has been a tough year with setbacks for voting rights. What will the coming year, a big midterm election year, bring? For more on all of that, I want to bring in Donita Judge. She's an attorney who's worked on voting rights, voting issues in communities around the country with the Advancement Project. Hendrik Hertzberg, he's a senior editor and staff writer at The New Yorker. And Wendy Weiser, she's director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And Christina Bellantoni, she is soon to be the editor-in-chief of Roll Call. I used to write for Roll Call. Congratulations on that, Christina. She'll be starting next month. And thank you all for joining us this morning. So we're looking sort of here at the year in voter ID, the year in voting rights. And maybe to put this in perspective, we can just put some numbers on the screen to start the conversation. And that is in the year 2013. This is information courtesy of the Brennan Center. But as of December 19th, at least 92 restrictive bills had been introduced in 33 states. That's this year. Of those, 13 restrictive bills are still pending in 5 states. Of those, 5 restrictive bills are currently active in 2 states. That means they're in hearings, there's committee activity, there's votes taking place, that sort of thing. And 8 states have already passed 9 restrictive bills this year. So that's just in the year 2013. This is something we've been talking about for a few years now, Donita, is this explosion in restrictive voting laws. When you look at where we are right now, how concerned are you going forward that this is just the start?
Well, I am very concerned that it's just the start. After the Supreme Court struck down that important provision of the Voting Rights Act, we saw states in the South who had been covered because of their history of discriminatory practices. We saw that right away they started to enact bills that were going to make it harder to vote. It was going to certainly be burdensome. And the individuals that I am meeting with and talking to do not have the type of ID that is going to be necessary for them to vote. And when we look at these polls, and the polls say that overwhelmingly, many people in the United States believe that photo ID is important. When we start to talk about to those same individuals about the restrictive underlying documents that are needed to get these IDs, then those numbers drop significantly. And I think that we've got to remember that, and that so it's not just about many people believing that individuals have to have photo ID. We have to really ask the right questions of those individuals.
Well, and so the story this year, I think, in terms of voting rights, the biggest single story this year was the Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court decision, which basically gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and you had a number of states, as we said in the intro there, that historically had to have prior approval from the Justice Department, Wendy, before they could change any of their voting rights laws. As soon as that was taken away by the court, for instance, you had Texas we can read this right here. Actually, this is the story of Texas this year, when Texas Attorney General, and he's also 2014 gubernatorial candidate Greg Abbott, went to vote earlier this year. He had to sign an affidavit because the name on his driver's license is slightly different than his name on the voter rolls, which is why Texas's voter ID law may be the toughest in the country. In Abbott's case, his probable Democratic opponent in next year's election, that State Senator Wendy Davis, also had trouble voting. She sponsored a bill to allow Texans to sign affidavits and vote and not be turned away completely. The law is proving especially tricky for women whose names often have changed due to marriage. So this is a law that went into effect that prior to the Supreme Court ruling would not have gone into effect, and it's threatening to radically change the way elections play out in Texas.
Absolutely. And Texas is a really good example of why it is that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is so critical. In the lead up to the 2012 election, courts blocked that. They found that it was discriminatory, this most stringent voter ID law in the country. Even though it's discriminatory, it is now in effect. Texans went to their state elections in 2013 having to show ID under this law, and unless and until a court blocks it under another provision of the Voting Rights Act, it's going to stay in effect. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Texas wasn't the only state that was covered by Section 5 that moved forward immediately after the Shelby County decision to put in place restrictions. And we're seeing this play out not only in states across the country, but even in counties, in localities across the country, which have also pushed forward restrictions that were previously blocked by the court and Department of Justice.
And so what is the legal strategy? I mean, we have the Obama Justice Department in a couple of these states. I think Texas is one of them. North Carolina is another. The Obama Justice Department is now trying to pursue a legal strategy. What does that strategy look like? Can you describe that to people?
Well, yeah, it is still illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in voting across the country. It's just a lot harder to get those laws blocked once you have a discriminatory law. You have to go to court. That used to happen automatically. We used to have a streamlined system. We had made this very easy to prevent discriminatory voting laws from going into effect. That's no longer the case. But there are a lot of ways that you can block them. There's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which applies nationwide. Every state and county in the country cannot discriminate on the basis of race and could be sued under that section. There are state constitutional provisions, federal constitutional provisions, and other federal laws that are still in effect. So we still have strong protection.
And it's talking about, like, voters need help here in a way, right? Because previously the burden was basically on the state. That's what the pre-clearance requirement called for. When you start talking about Section 2, that basically puts the burden on the voter or somebody helping the voter to say, hey, there's a problem here and I'm going to proactively
to be able to prove that they were trying to discriminate and putting the law in place, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do in the courts. And what the Supreme Court did is they asked Congress to come up with new guidelines here. And of course, Congress isn't getting a whole lot done. The CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, came up with some recommendations, but we've seen no legislation. I mean, it's been more than 6 months since this decision, and they're not necessarily talking about coming in and doing it immediately when they're back in January. So this is a long time, and you might not see anything in place before the 2014 midterm election.
Well, let's talk about another one of these. One of the most high-profile curbs on voting rights came in North Carolina this year. That's where Republican Governor Pat McCrory signed new restrictions into law over the summer. Among them were measures to shorten the early voting period from 17 days to 10, also ending same-day registration during early voting. It also banned the extension of voting hours due to long lines at the polls. And on top of that, McCrory also implemented a stringent voter ID law to go into effect in the 2016 presidential election. And he took issue with critics in this video statement.
Let me be direct. Many of those from the extreme left who have been criticizing photo ID are using scare tactics. They're more interested in divisive politics than ensuring that no one's vote is disenfranchised by a fraudulent ballot.
Rick, he says divisive politics, and I can think of little more that's been divisive this year than a lot of stuff that's happened in North Carolina, but particularly this push on voting rights in North Carolina.
Yeah, well, the background to this, in a way, is the Supreme Court in jurisprudence has suggested that it's okay to discriminate on the basis of political belief. That's been true in redistricting cases. And what all of these laws are being adopted in states at the expense of Democrats. They're all Republican laws, and they're designed to suppress not fraudulent voting, but democratic voting. That's what they're about. And of course, the racism of it is kind of a byproduct of that. Those are the groups, blacks, Hispanics. Those are the groups that are likely to be disenfranchised by these laws. And the giveaway is, well, what does shortening voting hours and eliminating voting days have to do with alleged voter fraud? No, that's nothing to do with it. That's only about one thing, as all these laws are. suppressing the votes of Democrats.
Keeping the turnout low among the most Democratic-friendly constituencies that are out there. Well, we'll pick that up in a second, because I teased it a little bit in the setup. There was this really interesting study that came out of UMass Boston this week that looked at exactly where these laws are popping up, demographically speaking. We'll detail that a little bit and talk about it when we come back.